Blog Talk Radio.
Good morning. This is your host, Llorraine Neithardt, and it's a beautiful day in New York City, and I'm going to take a fabulous walk in Central Park after I finish today, and this is Venus Unplugged, your virtual heartbreak hotel, and we've been going over and exploring fairy tales. Now, what do fairy tales have to do with Venus? Everything. The fairy tale of Snow White, which I've been doing for the last couple of months, it's a story of individuation, which is a Jungian term. That's a path of wholeness. And our culture has really been distorted or cheated in many ways about the value of fairy tales. And, we've watched Walt Disney, and that's what we think is really going on there, or interpretations or the television about what fairy tales are. And one of the greatest distortions, I think, is, the happy ever after. Well, there's an unexamined life if you really believe there's a happy ever after, which means one-sided. Nothing is going to affect you. There will be no growth. Without the opposites coming into our life, particularly in love, there will be no growth. And this concept causes so much suffering in us, whether it's conscious or unconscious. Or, I want to be the princess. Well, me personally, I want to be an empress. I'd rather run the kingdom and really have a great time and not be the victim of just being a princess. But that's my personal thing. So this, what I want to talk about the fairy tale code, as I call it, is how do we look at a fairy tale? How is it different than a myth or a saga or a legend, and certainly as a dream? So fairy tales are ancient. Some research says they're 25,000 years old. Okay, the Egyptians had fairy tales. The fairy tale that I work with is basically the Grimm, okay, because the Grimm brothers, could you imagine having the name of Grimm? But what are you going to do? They may feel the same thing about Neithardt. What do I know? Okay, so with the Grimm brothers, they just went around and recorded, like literally recorded, tales from Europe. And so they very rarely did they add something of their own. And fairy tales are very interesting because they are a basic cross-cultural. You'll find the same themes in cultures that a fairy tale will tell. And a fairy tale is a story. It's about our own connection to patterns in the unconscious and in the psyche. See, myth, the archetypal reality of myths, now archetype are psychic patterns, okay? Myth is more about our relationship with divine forces, the Zeus and the Aphrodite, and myth is supposedly like the truth, like this is the way that it is. This is what it's going to be about. If we, they're stories of archetypal encounters, and they're metaphor for archetypes. So these are basic patterns in the human psyche, and a myth describes the relationship between the gods and humans. So there's this quality of absolute truth. If we, violate the rules of one of the gods or goddesses, there's something, we pay for it. We see it, and this is what this is about. So there's a sacred history in mythology. And it's kind of how we became human and the laws of what it is to be human. And it's the reality of the sacred. And it serves as a model for human action or how to behave. So it's very, very different. That is the connection, mythos, and the myth is the story of, or the patterns, archetypal patterns of humanity and the gods or the goddesses. So, but fairy tales, on the other hand, are different. Fairy tales give us a working sense about what's in the collective unconscious. Some people, and this is very, very old concept, ancient, was that fairy tales were created from first dreams. And anybody who's involved with the Aborigine and the dream time, there's that powerful motif, which is a whole other story. So, all right, so with our fairy tales, these are stories from the collective unconscious, and they're developed around archetypal themes. So they've emerged from prehistoric times. First they were oral, then they were written. And they have classic motifs, and they're similar in the collective unconscious, and the same in all humanity, cross-culture. So that's why there's always a Cinderella theme, and there's always the giants, and there's, all of, in every culture. Now, what's fascinating about fairy tales, they're the symbols. They're a vehicle for the unconscious. And they talk about patterns that will bring us, hopefully, into wholeness, paths. There's no moral judgment. In the hands of Christianity, there's more Christianity. It's imbued with that. But in the Grimm, it's just the tale. Here's the tale, nothing but this. Okay. And when we learn to listen, now, psyche knows what it means, your unconscious knows what it means, but the whole trick to loving consciously and being conscious and becoming your individual self, kind of the divine plan, we kind of need to know this code. What are we listening to? If a fairy tale is fulfilling the ego, like in the happy ever after business, that's not true. Because as soon as we get one polarity, the opposite automatically starts coming in. And the whole trick of consciousness, which is a hard-earned knowledge, believe me, I spent 25 years, in archetypal anguish, trying to figure all out these different things, and I've got a little bit of a handle, but continue, because it's absolutely fascinating that what's running the show, which is the unconscious. And so fairy tales give us a hint as to what psyche looks like. So the interesting thing about fairy tales is they're like one-dimensional. And humans and animals and mirrors can speak, and there's no differentiation between that, and people do not find that strange. Okay, like in the story of fairy tale. What's with the talking mirror? I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. You got this mirror that's talking. I mean, that would keep, that would definitely keep us talking, okay? But in the fairy tales, this is just the way that it is. There's not great emotional responses in fairy tales. You're sent on a task, And not in this case, this child, this infant, this holy infant is born. She's destined to become whole, or she's going to be given every opportunity. Her mother dies. She's motherless for 7 years. That's astounding. But the fairy tale doesn't describe, what she wore and who was her nannies and how did she get to age 7. And then enters her life the evil stepmother with the mirror. And the mirror is just neutral. It just tells you who's the prettiest in the land. And all that can bring. So that's what happens in fairy tales, these extraordinary images. But there's no great emotional amplification going on. The feelings and the reactions are not described. These are also, like the mirror, okay, or talking animals, these are otherworldly. But in fairy tales, it's just like, yeah, okay, cool. Or the hero or the heroine is given a magical talisman, and they use it at the appropriate moment. It's not like, oh, man, this is like cool. Let me see if this works. It's like, gee, I don't know why I was given this, wand or a pig's tail or whatever it is, what the talisman might be. So this is how we look at this. These are hinting. Numbers are very important in fairy tales. Okay, they're usually 1, 3, 7, and 12. Those are pretty significant numbers. And for those of you that are involved in numerology, you can look that up. But they would be different meaning in the fairy tale than you would perceive them in numerology. But usually the fixed formulas are 1, 2, 3, 7, and 12. That combination. So we look at that and we see what that is about. So the core structure of the fairy tale has this kind of one-dimensionality, all right? But it doesn't involve the reader or the storyteller in descriptions. Snow White, we're dealing with 3 colors, white, black, and red. And it's interesting, in fairy tales, it's always primary colors. There's a lot of gold or silver, red, white, black, blue, sometimes green, rarely. So that's interesting, too. That these are just primary colors. So they don't tell you, well, the witch was wearing Louboutin shoes and was burnt alive. There's no description like that, which is kind of fascinating because we provide the description for good or ill. It doesn't really matter what we do. And that's why, with the Walt Disney, although I'm thrilled that he created all of that, people are very prejudiced on what it really is supposed to be. It's like when I was looking for images of the Snow White, it's like, what? Snow White was not a dominatrix. These outfits she has on, she was 7. And what is the number 7? The sacred number of 7 is a holy place where it's the age. If we look at it as an age, it's the age when we start to become conscious between good and evil. But the pictures, they've got it all dressed up with push-up bras and dominatrix. What's with that? That's how far removed from the essence of the feminine that is. Rather than this profound teaching story that at 7, okay, it's not literally, it can be literally, but, at 7, whenever we hit 7 within ourselves, we're going to start to become conscious. And perhaps one of the things we become conscious is that we're motherless, and we were raised by motherless. Big motif. And the motherless can doesn't mean it's absolute, mean that we've lost connection to the goddess, to the divine feminine. We don't have that connection. We have a patriarchal image. So these stories remind us, they're the building blocks to consciousness. And with the hero or the heroine, I mean, they're just picked. Very often it's, the last child or the three sons, and it's usually the dumb one, the youngest one, who out of pure innocence, and they don't learn from one another. That's another thing in fairy tales. It's not like, when you get into that forest, be careful of the first left turn. Nobody warns anybody. Birds, animals will warn. That's another thing. This bird is talking to you? It's giving you messages? That's not extraordinary. It's just given. And I also feel that when these stories began, it was given that we could commune with all, with rocks and spirits and animals and the heavens and the earth. So that's a memory there. No big thing. I mean, most of us, if a bird started to talk to us, we'd be telling the whole world, or we'd faint, okay? But in fairy tales, nope, it's all cool. It's just the way the tale is being told. And so these are pure archetypal energies. Now, when we're reading a fairy tale, we also need to consider, which or someone is interpreting a fairy tale for us, okay? So are they a thinking type? Or now a thinking type is going to, or the thinking type within you, it's going to look at the structure or the motif of the fairy tale. And the feeling type is going to look at what the emotional response is. And the sensate type will amplify the symbols. They'll give it a whole other value. And an intuitive type, they kind of get the meaning of the whole kind of package, the essence of it. So that's why fairy tales can be interpreted in so many different ways. And yet the truth of the fairy tale is basic and sacred and correct according to the collective unconscious, which very often we do not give enough credit to. The collective unconscious is the patterns, the building blocks, the way it is. And then the mind, or the thinking, builds everything all around it. Maybe correct, it may not be. But the hero or the heroine is the one who's selected. So it usually starts off with, a kind of a timelessness. Once upon a time, well, what's the date? They don't say, January 30th, 1929. There's no dates. It's once upon a time. So you're already invited to this timeless, spaceless place. It prepares your psyche for this extraordinary journey. And it has a great depth, and it has this kind of abstract style. And we trust it. It's kind of, wow, amazing. We suspend, our scientific belief. That couldn't possibly be. But in the world of fairy tale, it's all true. So in the depth of our psyche, it's true. But we're the ones that will give the meaning. And like with Snow White, she trusts. She's giving Opportunities. Remember the 3 times that the evil stepmother, it's like, come on, really? You fell for this 3 times? But she does, and she has to fall for it 3 times, the 3 temptations, because she's not going to grow unless she trips up. She falls for this. There's a pattern. 3 is also that number of creation. And also in a fairy tale, if you're warned of something, it's usually given, the warning is usually given 3 times, exactly the same way. And in our modern day life, somebody will, if you hear it for the 3rd time, would you please pay attention? Or just consciously say, I'm ignoring it, so when it hits you upside the head, you know why. Okay? And the hero or the heroine, they just act. Snow White at 7, she's the queen, the evil queen, decides, she's going to rip out her heart and liver and eat it, which is kind of an interesting image. I mean, that would freak anybody out. And the huntsman takes her into the forest. Now, Snow White's not freaked out. She's just on her way into the forest, and there's usually a forest. Nobody describes the forest. Where is the forest? It's just a forest. Forest represents the unconscious. So within the realm of the unconscious, all this change is going to happen. We need to go into the forest. There can be transformation in the sea, but I haven't ever heard of anything on a beach. I suppose there's some, but maybe that's Egyptian. So there is this experience also where these extraordinary events occur, and there's just complete trust. In the case with Snow White, she trusts the 7 dwarfs. They come in, they help her, they broker a deal. She's got to do the cooking and cleaning and be useful because she's learning and she's growing, and they'll protect her. But on some level, the protection is going to keep her limited. It's going to keep her in the house with the 7 dwarfs, and she'll never know who she is. And I think that's one of the reasons that hints at why she went for the temptation 3 times. And these otherworldly beings are geographically far, but spiritually near in fairy tales. The fairy godmother. That's a way distance, but it's near to the hero or the heroine in fairy tales. And the beings in fairy tales are not afraid of otherworldly beings. They just that's the perception. You marry a frog, nobody makes a big thing out of it. That's what you got to do. So that it's very fascinating how we can allow, because when we allow this, we don't realize that we're allowing it. When this occurs, when this in this experience, we're actually touching the collective unconscious, a resource of enormous life. And this is how we contact it. And when it gets triggered, it's a way that we can start understanding experiences that are happening in our life. Modern day, well, it's not fairy tales, it's movies. People go to the movies and watch something, which usually is absolutely related to something that they're going through. And so in fairy tales, things are very they have sharp outlines and pure color, and the place is dark. It doesn't say, well, it's kind of like indigo. It's not indigo. It's black. It's dark. And fairy tales don't describe people or places. It just says, go to the glass city. Well, we're in the glass city, but the hero or the heroine goes to the glass city, and then something extraordinary happens. I see this happen every day, where a person is in an extraordinary state of transformation. And in the middle of it, they want to know why. You wouldn't even understand it if you understood the why. Just go through the journey, and then you'll understand why. Why do we have to get disappointed? Because we need to bring the opposite in. Why, if we're projecting someone to be the hero or the heroine or the prince or the princess or the savior or whatever, that burdens that human. They can't do our bidding. We have to do our own bidding. That's part of what the journey is about. It's not allowing that. Everybody has a different, and whatever is your favorite fairy tale from when you were a kid, pretty much it's autobiographical. You've experienced that tale again and again in your life. If you know what you're reading and what you're looking at. Okay? And so the forests aren't named or never described, and the fairy tales, the objects and the shapes and are just consistent. They're kind of like solid material, solid and basic, okay? Simple names of object. There's a lot of dying in fairy tales, okay? Dying's a big theme in a fairy tale, but it's always very neat. No blood and gore. All right. Actually, I think Rumpelstiltskin is the only one that is kind of like a suicide, okay? Because he rips himself in half. But that could also represent, ripping the self in half in order to create an opposite, which is we create an opposite so that there's a new level of growth. And that's important to be able to accept. But in the modern day interpretations, there is this erroneous belief that we're supposed to be happy ever after. This only can happen to us once, when these motifs are happening every single day in all different ways. So when we can move into the fairy tale and the interpretations of the fairy tale, and of course Marie von Franz in the interpretation of fairy tale is an excellent book. It's very scholarly, but for those who really want to get into it, okay, she goes over it. And Jung, of course, used and also in the training as a Jungian, you need to interpret fairy tales. You need to know how to do that, because that's prelude to interpreting dreams. Now, dreams are our personal fairy tale, coming from our own unconscious. And fairy tales are the collective unconscious. So, I can't believe it's 90 seconds. Oh, good. Okay, so that's part of what we're looking at. We are looking at why these fairy tales, why it's misunderstood, what are these about, and that the extremes in fairy tales, people are either very beautiful or very ugly. There's these stupendous feasts or the starving crumbs. You're eating crumbs, all right? There's heinous crime. They kill children. This is everything that's going on, but it's not blood and guts. It's events that break up and come back together again. So there's a great grief. It teaches us how to go very, very deeply, how to look at the grief in fairy tales, and yet it doesn't tell us what to feel or not to feel. So try to remember what your favorite fairy tale is. Reread it, okay, in the original, the Grimm's, and just note where you feel something, where you kind of go unconscious, where it's like, I don't understand this, because that's when we don't understand something, that means a complex has been kicked up, and that's how we can get some insight. And I'll be back next week. So go to the website, LorraineNeithardt.com, and or download the episode and listen to it, tell the world. And next week I am going to be putting up the whole story of Snow White on YouTube. Hey, on our 21st century. Okay, next week. Yay. And if that frog jumps in your purse, it's like you don't have to marry it, but you can talk to it and listen to all the things that are going on, because fairy tales are real on another level of reality. Bye.
Progressive presents Mindfulness with Flo.
You are a mighty fortress of supreme knowledge. Progressive Direct has not only revealed their rates, but those of their competitors. If you were any more in the know, you would be drowning in, the know.
Compare Progressive Direct rates with competitors' rates, because knowledge is power. Visit Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.